We do almost all of our early learning in company. We spend almost all of our waking hours, certainly during the first, couple of years of life, pretty much every single moment we're awake, we're in the company of an adult. So this idea of kind of attention as a shared thing, yeah, I'm sitting there typing on my laptop, and my kids are immediately interested in what in my laptop, not because it's particularly a particularly interesting thing, just because it's what I'm paying attention to.
Oh.
Yeah, they're wired to be very, very sensitive to these kind of social influences.
Hi, I'm Crystal Luce, Professor of Education.
And I'm Aimee Ketchum, pediatric occupational therapist.
Welcome to Plant the Seed of Learning, the podcast where we merge education and medical models to bring you science-based practical insights on all things early childhood.
Whether you're a parent, teacher, therapist, or policymaker, we're here to help you support children from the start.
Welcome. We are so excited. We have a guest today, Professor Sam Wass, and he is a child psychologist and neuroscientist who studied at Oxford, London, and Cambridge. He leads a world-leading institute for the science of early years in East London, where he and his team study how fast-changing early childhood environments shape attention, learning, and stress. His research spans both typical and atypical development, including ADHD, autism, and anxiety, and he collaborates on international projects investigating early development. Sam has published over 100 academic articles and a book, and is ranked among the top 2% most cited researchers in his field. He frequently appears in the media as an expert on child development, advising the UK Departments of Education and Health, charities such as Save the Children, and brands including Kinder, Lego, and Disney. Wow. We are so fortunate, and we can't wait for you all to hear this episode. But let's start off with our fact or fiction. Fact or fiction, Aimee, AI toys are great for development of learning and communication.
That is absolutely fiction, Crystal.
Yes, you are so spot on. We suggest a word of caution when it comes to AI toys. These technologies are reaching children during the earliest and most formative years of life, from birth to 8, when relationships, play, language, and health shape the foundations for lifelong learning and well-being. The question is no longer whether AI will shape childhood, but how to ensure it does so in ways that support healthy development from the very beginning, while preserving the core of what makes us human. Finding balance with technology and play is suggested. So, considering that, let's move right in to our questions so we can get this podcast going. I know you're anxious to hear from our expert guest. So, Professor Wass, can you tell us what you are most excited about as a developmental cognitive scientist that studies how early environments shape early development?
Yeah, I guess because I guess my starting point is basically just how, the field of neuroscience, the developmental neuroscience, is changing very, very fast. We basically only had the ability to look inside a awake child's brain for about kind of 25 years for the first real study that came out, kind of measuring kind of live brain function in children. And we're kind of on the cusp of another big paradigm shift. So we started to do this, and now we're starting to do it differently. In one way in particular, which is basically in Western societies, we're used to thinking about the kind of unit of identity, what makes where one person starts and another one stops, very much within our own individual. We have this very individualistic way of, thinking about who we are and, what our identity is. And we're used to kind of studying brains in that way. So we take, a child out of their normal setting. We take them into a very artificial, very controlled environment. We, flash some information up at them on a computer screen or play it to them on some speakers, but in a very, very controlled, predetermined way. And we look at, how their brains kind of process that information. And, that pretty much everything that we know about children's brains comes from these types of studies where you're taking children out of their environment. And kind of what we're trying to do with my work, and a lot of other people are thinking about this too, thinking about a big shift in how we study children, away from this idea that individual kind of brains kind of the unit of identity is us, towards thinking about this idea, which is, in fact, all of our kind of being is relational. Yeah. So it's not that, I have stuff inside my brain that is processing. It's about, the act of paying attention to something is about a relationship between me and the thing that I'm paying attention to. It's intimately informed by the different settings that I'm in, what I'm paying attention to, as well as, the people around me. So that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. We do almost all of our early learning in company. We spend almost all of our waking hours, certainly during the first, couple of years of life, pretty much every single moment we're awake, we're in the company of an adult. So this idea of kind of attention is a shared thing. Yeah. I'm sitting there typing on my laptop and my kids are immediately interested in what in my laptop, not because it's a particularly interesting thing, just because it's what I'm paying attention to. Yeah, they're wired to be very, very sensitive to these kind of social influences. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. This idea of, our environments, the things around us, the physical environment that we're surrounded by, but also the people, what they're doing, how they pay attention to, are crucial for understanding individual differences between children. We can't just say, this child, has a quote unquote problem with their brain, and this problem is just located in a child's brain. This problem is about the relationship between, a child and their environment. So this poses a lot of challenges for how we do neuroscience, how we measure children's
Yeah.
brains. But I think it's really, really crucial as a new way of studying child development.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
fascinated by this. And I was sitting here thinking how I have four children, and they
Mhm.
are all what I thought in the same environment, but they're all vastly different because
Mhm.
each child is responsive to different circumstances in their own environments.
Yeah, and this is another area, because to where, from a research point of view, we really, really don't have, any ability to track this at all at the moment. This idea of the kind of the gene evoked environment. So we're used to thinking of, genes as something that happens outside us. But and then, sorry, genes happen inside us and environments happen outside us. But in fact, they're really, really closely interrelated in that how I interact with things around me determines what information I get back from environments. Yeah. So, if I'm, a child in an early years setting who is, shying away from the other children, spending their whole time with their back to the other children, kind of pushing a train up and down a train track repeatedly throughout the whole day, compared to another child who is doing, joint imaginative play in a group of three children. They're physically in the same environment, they're physically in the same room, but they're getting different stuff from them. Yeah. So how we interact with things around us determines what information we get back from us. And this is really crucial. And we really honestly don't have any ability at all to, track this at the moment, because all of our understanding of brains and how they develop comes, as I say, from taking children out of their settings and presenting them controlled stuff to measure how their brains kind of respond differently. So what you say is absolutely crucial, and hopefully we're going to know a lot more about this in a few years' time.
Yeah.
That's so exciting. It's really groundbreaking when you think about neuroscience sort of merging with that relational science of learning,
Mhm.
how children are relating to others and
Mhm.
studying from that perspective. It's very exciting.
Yeah, yeah, and it's practically important too. We're going to be talking later about this book that we just done, first of some books we're doing, and there we talk for the point of view of early years practitioners about this idea that, if I've in a setting and I've got 15 children in that setting, and 14 of them are work doing just fine, and then there's a one child who's really struggling to focus, really struggling to pay attention. It's very tempting to think that it's a problem with that
Yes.
child.
Yes.
If this setting works for 14 out of 15 children in this setting, but it doesn't work for one child, it must be a problem with that child. And we really try to, change this mindset to get to this idea of it's about, the relationship. Everything is about the relationship between a child and their environment.
Mm.
And maybe you change the environment and suddenly that child concentrates absolutely fine. And different children, different plants, different flowers, we use this metaphor, if a flower doesn't bloom, you don't change the flower, you change the environment that it's growing in. And
Absolutely.
it's exactly the same idea for understanding child development, I think.
That's
Makes perfect
beautiful.
sense. Yeah. So we know you're interested in the development of attention control. So like
Mhm.
how we choose to allocate our attention, what a child might attend to, and also arousal control of how we would change our behavior. So can you tell us a little bit about more about this in your area of research?
Yeah, sure. So I think kind of this question ties really neatly to what we were just talking about. So we're used to thinking of kind of attention control as something that very much comes from within. Yeah.
Hmm.
I always think of that picture, that famous statue of Rodin the thinker, someone crouched down on a stool with their fist pressed to their forehead.
Yes.
As something that's really effortful. Yeah. So I'm concentrating on something that's really, really effortful. Like a little person, a lot of this stuff breaks down to the idea of like a homunculus. There's someone within my brain choosing what I pay attention to. Um, and there are certainly elements of that are true in terms of kind of brain science. But there's another element which is really, really crucial, which is really, really underappreciated, which is that is only one of the things that determines how we pay attention. And the other thing is kind of what we call attention capture. So how different elements within our environment can pull our attention towards them. So we start the book by it's actually got a picture of a fly on the cover, and we start the book with the idea that if you've ever tried to teach a lesson with a fly buzzing around in your classroom, you'll have learned one of the book's really, really important lessons. Flies aren't particularly interesting. They're not particularly dangerous. They're not particularly, threatening. But it's absolutely impossible to concentrate on anything when you've got a fly buzzing around. And, we use this to introduce this idea that, particular things within environments kind of tend to automatically capture our attention. So I can be trying to tune into something like my teacher who is telling me a story that I'm interested in. But if I've got something like a fly buzzing around, we have these kind of hardwired brain mechanisms um, that most of them have developed probably we think for evolutionary reasons. 10,000 years ago our environments were pretty dangerous,
Mhm.
and if there was movement that happened anywhere in my peripheral visual field, it was likely to be either something coming to eat me or something that I could eat. And
Yeah.
so we've evolved to have this very hardwired tendency to pay attention to movement. And it's very, very hard to override. It's kind of a pre-attentive mechanism. So that's one of the things. Kind of movement, bright colors also kind of automatically attract our attention in the same way. So I guess the really important thing, I think, from the point of view of a parent, as well as from the point of view of a practitioner, is, if you've got a child who's struggling to concentrate, then, thinking about concentration as a mental muscle, yeah, is because that child's not trying hard enough to concentrate, isn't by any means the only way you need to think about this. It's about thinking about the environment that the child's in,
Course.
and it's thinking about, is there a lot of kind of movement and noise, all of these things that we know automatically capture our attention in their field of view, yeah, which will make it harder for them to concentrate even if they want to, yeah. So if I'm an early years teacher, if I think of what's the child's perspective on my face when they're sitting listening to me tell a story, have I got a window behind my face in which the children can see movement, yeah. When the child is sitting in a setting at home where I want them to be, helping them to be focused, is there a lot of interesting stuff in their visual field? I mean, I just was yesterday sat in a cafe trying to do some work. And I was sat, as you always do, with my back to the room, looking out in the room, and I was like looking up around, all this movement there, movement there, movement there. And then I thought, actually, Sam, think about it. And I turned and to face myself towards the wall, and which obviously massively improved my concentration. But it's amazing, I
Yeah.
don't think about myself, I don't think about this myself, let alone from my kids' point of
Right.
view. So there's a lot of really, really important stuff to be
Yeah.
thinking about here in terms of this, how we can use attention capture, either minimizing distractions or making ourselves more easier to pay attention to by using things like movement and those things that we know pull our attentions to pull children's attention towards me as well.
Yes, and as an occupational therapist, I'm sitting here thinking of the child with sensory delay, where their fly is a scratchy tag in their shirt, or the lights, or someone walking in the hallway, or, anything that can be affecting their ability to attend. So that's such a great
Yeah.
analogy.
Yeah,
Truly.
and that goes up and down a lot. Yeah, no, that's we do a lots and lots and lots of thinking about that. Yeah, and also from a point of view, Amy, from the point of view of kind of sensory atypicalities, also atypicalities in how we do process sights and sounds around us, right? Because that's another really, really important aspect of difference.
And I'm thinking about the early learning teachers and their classrooms and how, well, I used to be a teacher and I used to teach kindergarten, and we used to make it so colorful and hang things everywhere and put everything all over the walls, not knowing that this was a huge distraction for some kids, maybe not all kids. But so I'm connecting with what
Yeah,
you're saying about
yeah,
movement
definitely.
and
So
brightness.
yeah, so we do a lot of kind of I do a lot of work talking to kind of early years educators about that, and we're actually writing a book on outdoor learning at the moment as a follow-on to the one that we've done on concentration. And we talk about this quite a bit. And this is something, I don't know how it works in the States, but this is something where awareness is starting to grow. So basically, we have kind of special needs provision. So we call them special educational needs and disabilities. And I just was in a meeting just a couple of hours ago about how we structure kind of special educational needs provisions for children in the UK. Um, and that is very focused on the environment and about, having an uncluttered environment where it's, the environment helps them to focus on things. So we have a lot of, sensory kind of quite a dark space with something that really, really captures their attention. But our mainstream education really isn't at all focused on that. And, I've been doing quite a lot of work trying to persuade our kind of government to make that part of the mainstream provision. So to make mainstream early years settings and mainstream schools much more like kind of special needs schools at the moment, in thinking much more about this. Um, but of course, it is. I don't know how widely spread that idea is. It is a really, really tricky kind of idea. You definitely need a balance. So, this is something we talk about a lot. You don't, there's one extreme, which is, you're dense, cluttered, loads and loads of movement, loads of bright colors everywhere you look. There's 10 things trying to pull my attention different ways, which, we know that young brains really, really struggle to focus in. And there's lots and lots of good evidence about that. But we also know that the other extreme of, a blank wall and a blank room where there's nothing going on
Mm.
is kind of, you can go too far that other extreme. And one of the things that we're thinking about with this outdoor learning is what's the difference between kind of learning in an outdoor setting versus learning in an indoor setting. And it isn't necessarily about the total amount of stuff that my brain has to process, as about the clarity. Yeah. So if you think about acoustics, for example, so one of children really, really struggle to learn from language input in a very noisy kind of bathroom acoustic, yeah, where I've got a lot of sounds kind of bouncing off walls. So, someone's talking to me and their voice will come straight to me, but their voice will also come and bounce off the walls and come back to me a few hundred milliseconds later. And, my mate Johnny, who's having a conversation over there, his voice will bounce off the wall and come back to me. So I get this very cluttered visual, auditory kind of setting. And one of the great things with outdoor environments is they're just cleaner. Yeah, this bouncing off the wall and information coming at me multiple times from kind of lots of different echoes and reverberant acoustics and that type of stuff just doesn't happen. Yeah, either the voice signal comes straight to you, or it doesn't come at all because it doesn't bounce off. So it's not that it's not particularly that it's a less stuff in the environment, but it's just a cleaner signal. Yeah. It's the same thing with vision. If there's something that I'm interested in, I can more easily get to the point where, this toy that I'm looking at is a focus of my focus of my visual field, but I don't have a lot of other stuff going on in the background. I don't have a lot of movement kind of in my visual field, or I don't have a lot of colors in my visual field. When I'm in an outdoor setting, it's easier for me to, when there's more space, it's easier for me to take the thing that I'm interested in and put it in a setting where there's less competing for it in my visual field. So you just get cleaner, more uncluttered environment. So I think that's a really, really important thing when we're thinking about optimizing environments for children. It's partly just about, stripping it away so there's not so much stuff, but it's also just about letting them, have this clean signal that they need, where the thing that they're trying to focus on is really primary and the other stuff is really minimized as much as you can.
Mm. Well, let's talk a little bit about environments and a child's early interactions, the earliest interactions with caregivers. and how these everyday environments influence their development.
Yeah, so that's another area, because we're doing lots and lots of research. And then, I mentioned at the beginning this idea that we spend almost every minute of our waking time when we're young children in the company of adults often, and then as we get older, more and more other children. Um, and we do a lot of research where we're rather than doing, as I say, what most people have done before, which is looking at children on their own individually when they're presenting pre-canned information at them. We do a lot of work where we just record, we're recording brain activity in a child and their adult at the same time while they're just interacting naturally. So we just
Love
put a
that.
bunch of toys down on the table and say interact as you would do at home. And what we're trying to get from this is some clues to this idea, which is kind of very evidence-based, which is that we learn better from face-to-face interactions than we do from screens. So, if I'm sharing a story, for example, I can either, consume that story from a pre-recorded YouTube clip, or I can have that story told to me by someone live. And there's lots and lots and lots of evidence that we pay attention and we learn more effectively from face-to-face interactions than we do than consuming the same information from screens. And we've done some work trying to look at why this is. And what we think it comes down to is this idea that uh, our adult brains are pretty stable and pretty predictable. Yeah, so we measure kind of electrical brain activity as a state of as a signal of what state our brain is in. Yeah, and everybody has their fluctuations in engagement during the course of a day. You fatigue and that type of stuff. So even as adults, we kind of fluctuate from a state when we're ready to engage, when we find it easy to pay attention, to another state where we don't. Yeah. But for children, these fluctuations are kind of more intense and more unpredictable. Yeah. So, if you think about it like an engine, a child's engine doesn't idle as smoothly. Yeah? There are times when they're ready to engage and there are times when they're not. And one of the things that we're looking at in our research is this idea that when I'm interacting as an adult with a child, I'm really, really closely tracking that child's attention state. Yeah. And I'm continually adapting, what I'm saying and how I'm saying it, dependent on these really, really fine-grained cues I'm getting from the child. So, for example, if a child's attention starts to wane, then I become more ups and down in my voice, yeah, on a really, really sub-second scale to try and help the child to get their attention back.
Mhm.
And then when that child is focused, that is the moment when I start to introduce the new information. This is a pen, or the new word label. Yeah. And if I do that, so if I'm ready to wait until the child is ready to pay attention to something before presenting the word label, then we've got lots and lots of evidence that that child learns it better than if I just pick up the pen and say, look at this, it's a pen, it's a pen. Yeah. And it's because this idea that children are this kind of children's brains are this engine. Sometimes they're ready to learn, sometimes I'm not. And as an adult, I'm skillfully adapting what I say and how I say it, dependent on the child's state, to make sure that the information gets to them when they're ready to hear it. And also that I help to, extend their information. So when they're interested in something, I can extend and engage and build on something that they're interested in already. And this is what, CoComelon can't do. Yeah. It can't track the child's state and judge what to present and how to present it dependent on the child's state. So this is one of the reasons we think why children do learn much better from face-to-face interactions than they do from screens.
Wow. Thank you for breaking that down and really explaining, why that human interaction is so much more beneficial. I know one of my favorite studies, and I'm sure you're aware of Patricia Kuhl's work with language development and the use of the fMRI, and finding that children who are English speaking, who had the lessons in Mandarin from a woman with puppets, and learned as much Mandarin as a Mandarin speaking child within 6 months. And when they did the exact same lessons on a screen, those children learned absolutely nothing. So, we have that data, but now you're really breaking it down and explaining why, which is what I think parents and teachers and therapists need to understand is, what is that difference and why is that so beneficial in early learning?
Mm.
So, yeah, so my next question, I think you probably already answered. We talked
Wow.
about this in our fact or fiction, and I think you're going to come back to this same point that you've been making. But there's a lot of talk about AI toys right now. There's a lot of talk about interactive screens. I think parents think these plush animals that talk to their children and interact with their children because they have an AI chip in them are good because they're interactive versus a screen. But we're seeing the same issues, right? Where it's not human. So tell us, we'd love to hear your
Yeah.
thoughts on AI toys and how that's going to affect early learning.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting because no, I think there's a few different things that point in different ways. So, that type of what I was so that type of monitoring these very fine-grained fluctuations in a child's state, yeah,
Mhm.
Mm.
um, and tracking and responding to those fine-grained fluctuations is something that we're very, very skillful at as adults, and technology is nowhere near as skillful at yet. That moments of judging at the millisecond level, when someone's ready to receive information and when they're not. Adults are very, very skilled at doing that. And technology isn't nearly so skilled yet. But when we get a little bit older, and when we get to an age of development as children, when we're reliably using kind of verbal cues like asking a question to indicate our state, then kind of arguably that type of, we call it contingency, that type of sensitivity becomes a bit less important because I can tell that if a child's asked a question, they're interested. But this idea that interactivity of child-led, you wait for them to ask a question before you tell them the answer. That is still really, really important. Yeah. So when we're looking at this with babies and the studies that I just was describing, we're looking at things like when a child looks to an object or they use these non-verbal cues to indicate that they're interested in something. But with older children, it's more like when a child asks you a question. Yeah. But this same idea that child-led learning being more effective is definitely true throughout development. Yeah. So I think there are definitely strengths and weaknesses to uses of technology. And one of the things I think that I think it does have some potential is this idea that technology can be very good at letting children ask questions and then giving them feedback, or letting them guess the answer to a question and then giving them feedback on whether that answer was right or not. Yeah. So for example, if I'm teaching phonics to 30 children, it's very hard as a kind of as a kindergarten teacher to be keeping the difficulty of the learning tasks, yeah, at exactly the level that's not too easy and not too hard for all of the children at once, because they're all at different levels. Yeah, we know that everybody pays attention best if I'm at my individual threshold of difficulty that I can manage, but it's very hard to keep that threshold for everybody at once. Yeah, whereas if I've got 30 different children separately interacting with stuff that gives them child-led things, then that solves that problem. Yeah. So I think where AI has strengths is it's very capable of feeding this type of child-led learning. There's a lovely book I've just been reading, which is actually, I was looking up for some other books that have done something similar, and it's like a story of a it was written a while ago, but by Neil Stevenson, called Diamond Age, about a girl who kind of grows up with her book, which is her own personalized kind of AI tutor. And she starts off being in an abusive household. She's her mum's married, has a series of stepfathers, who none of whom stay around for very long, but quite a few of them are quite abusive to this girl. And the book starts telling her these quite moving stories, kind of aimed at a 5-year-old girl, about helping her to deal with kind of the trauma that she's experiencing. And then as she grows older and starts asking more and different and more varied questions, it's always kind of feeding her the information that she needs for that particular age in her development. And it's very good at tracking, what she needs when and what's useful. So for that specific thing, interactive child-led curiosity learning, I think there are some kind of benefits from AI. The difficulties are obviously when we get to things like attachment, which is much more complicated, much more multimodal. We definitely can't do that. But also there's a kind of more subtle area of that, which is this idea that we learn best from one of the reasons that we never kind of get bored of interacting with other people is that other people are very, very complex systems. Yeah. And, even with my wife, I've been married to for 15 years, I can't quite predict how she's going to react in a given situation. And, this is a really good, long-term driver of learning with us. Yeah. So the bit that I'm less sure about with technology is this idea that you get these, we call them like a really straight contingency. Every time I say this, I get exactly the same response. Yeah. And staying for a long time in this very, very, very predictable situation isn't necessarily as good long term for my learning as being in a situation where I'm having a more unpredictable interaction with another person. Yeah.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
we need this kind of complexity and we need this uncertainty to keep on learning. Yeah. And in some ways, technology is good at giving us that uncertainty because it's very good at my kids were just what is gravity, yeah, and it's very good at answering any question that you can possibly want to ask it, yeah. So in that way of feeding our uncertainty, keeping us in this area where it knows a lot more than we do and it can give us that information whenever we request it. That part I think is very good for child's learning because it's very good at tracking what they're
Sure.
interested in and feeding
Sure.
that. But there are other ways in which the uncertainty is less good because it's more direct, more predictable, and you don't have that greater complexity you get from personal interaction. So yeah, so that was a very long answer. It's quite a
That's
complicated
okay.
area,
No,
I
that
think.
was great. I love how you touched upon the complexity of human beings, people. And it's really important that children understand the whole serve and return process, taking cues from facial expressions and all that good stuff. And we also talked about attention and the ability to develop attention. That's part of being able to interact with people. I wait for my cues to talk. I watch when you're done talking. That's my turn. So this is a lot this is actually connected to self-regulation. So how does self-regulation develop in young children? And how do
Yeah.
environments influence this?
Mm. Yeah, so we've done a lot of work on this. So as well as tracking tube interacting brains when they're paying attention, we also do a lot of work where we put these little kind of microphones, little cameras, and little stress monitors on kind of babies and young children, whilst we're also recording from the parents in home settings and also from the educators in educational settings. And a lot of the same ideas that I've been talking about come through, particularly this idea that during early development our state is more unstable. Yeah, I was talking about how our brains don't idle as smoothly when we're children. Sometimes I'm ready to pay attention, sometimes I'm not. And naturally, anyone who spent any time with young children in any setting will know that their kind of arousal state, what we
Yeah.
call it, how awake, alert they are, how engaged, is more up and down. Yeah. And that same process that I was mentioning with attention development, why
Hmm.
we pay attention better in face-to-face interactions than we do from screens because it's the adult continually adapting what they say and how they say it, dependent on these kind of up and down fluctuations in a child. We think it's the same idea in terms of arousal. So I'm continually, naturally, if I'm interacting with my kids, I'm continually adapting, what I say, and also, my facial expression dependent on their state. Yeah. If they get upset, I will naturally, change my face to mimic their face. You kind of parrot their emotions back. You do the same thing with your voice. And, if Stella, my 7-month-old daughter, is upset, then naturally I'd soothe her. My 5-year-old daughter, Rose, if she stubs her toe, I naturally kind of soothe her. So you're kind of adapting what you do dependent on the child's state to give them what they need on a second by second basis. Yeah, just as I am with in terms of concentration. And one of the questions I often get asked, particularly in the north of England, I can probably say this safely because you probably won't have many listeners from the north of England. But when I'm in the north of England, we have this. We're more of this mindset that it's good for children to leave children to tough it out by themselves.
Oh,
And I'm often getting asked this question, when I talk about this co-regulation, how, you're using your own state to help manage these moment by moment changes in a child's state. Um, they say, well, does that mean that they're losing the opportunity to learn to do it for themselves? Yeah. So if I'm continually, doing kind of helping a child to manage their emotional ups and downs, are they missing an opportunity to learn self-control? Yeah. And in fact, the evidence is exactly the opposite for that. That the more involved I am in it as an adult in early kind of co-regulation, um, the better the child kind of co-regulates for themselves later on. Yeah, and it's very hard to be sure why that is, but we think it's probably something to do with this fact that if I am with a carer or whether an educator or a parent who's consistently changing their state, to help me to be in the state that I need to be in, it kind of builds up two things, we think. One is it helps to build up kind of self-awareness of what state I'm in moment by moment. Yeah. If my carer is matching their state to mine and being responsive to these moment by moment fluctuations, it helps me to gain self-awareness about what my own state is. Yeah. Which helps me to learn how to self-regulate. If I'm aware I'm getting upset, then eventually I learn to know what to do to help myself calm down. But this self-awareness that I am getting upset is a
Yeah.
really, really crucial kind of thing. So that's one of the things that we think might be important. And the other thing that we might think might be important is just, building up this muscle memory. This is the state that I'm used to being in. This is my kind of average idling state. Yeah. I learn that that's my idling state early on through my carer helping me to stay in that state. Yeah. But then once I get used to being in that state, it's easier to stick in that state during later. So those are a couple of things that we think might be explaining this, but it's very, very hard to be sure about any of those. But we have got good quality evidence that the more involved an adult is in helping me manage my emotional ups and downs during later development, when I'm as a young child, the
Mhm.
better I'm able to do that for myself during later development. We've got good evidence for that. It's just hard to be sure, exactly why that is. But I've suggested a couple of ideas that we're working on.
Absolutely. Yes. Children borrow from our regulation before they're able to regulate themselves. That's
Yeah.
such a great way to explain that.
Yeah, I do. I always laugh about this. My wife, because on Sunday my children heard me behind a shed. I was trying to hammer these nails and I couldn't get them in, and I was in absolute furious mood. And I won't say what I was shouting at the top of my head, but my children were like, "What's wrong with Daddy, Mummy?" So nobody manages to do it all the time, but yeah.
No,
Exactly.
certainly.
We're all human, right? Oh, that's
Mm.
funny. So, can you tell us a little bit about your book, Take Action on Distraction?
Mm. Yeah, so we talk a lot about kind of a couple of the ideas that I've been talking about already. So we talk about this idea of attention capture and attention control. I mentioned this idea of a fly and how environments influence our attention. And we also talk about this interactive element of how you're continually adapting what you're saying and how you're saying it dependent on the child. But we also talk about another area which is challenging again this idea that I started with about attention control, and it's about, a mental muscle. Yeah. Um, and as I say, like a lot of ideas in neuroscience, that's partly true and partly not true. Yeah. Um, meditation training, for example, is a very pure form of concentration training where it does feel like you're training that mental muscle of concentration. Yeah, you start off with doing exercises around that. How well can I focus my attention? Yeah. And it does, there are beneficial evidence, good evidence beneficial effect. So it's partly true, but it's also not the whole story. Yeah. And one of the things that we talk about a lot in the book is this idea that it's a cliche. Every parent of every child with ADHD has made thought, well, they've got no problems concentrating on stuff that they're interested in. Yeah. Um, and we talk about this area where, frankly, the neuroscience is, quite a way behind this idea that why is it that some things are easy to concentrate on, and some things are hard? And we talk about this idea that our brains are prediction machines. So every word that I'm saying as you're listening to me, your brain is generating a prediction for what I'm going to say next. And we talk about how our brains are wired to seek out situations where you can predict what's going to happen next some of the time, but not all of the time. Yeah. So, if I was, to start saying the same word over and over again, yeah, you would very rapidly predict what word I was going to say next, so you wouldn't be learning so much from what I was saying. Yeah, we learn from times when testing, was that prediction I made correct or not? And if we always get it right, then we don't learn so much. And if we always get it wrong, we don't learn so much. And we do best learning where you can predict what's going to happen next some of the time, but not all the time. Yeah. Um, and so we talk about this idea of, it's back to this idea of, if I've got children in the class who are struggling to concentrate, it might be because the content is too easy, or it might be because the content is too hard. Yeah. And how do you keep children at that focus where, I'm getting the right level of difficulty? How do you work out, is it easy and too hard? Obviously, a lot of the way to do this is through child-led attention, and children are very, very good at seeking out, learning opportunities for themselves. But as an early years educator, I can't always be doing child-led learning. I have to,
Right.
get them in a row and, teach them particular content that I have to get through. I have a curriculum I need to get through. So
Yeah.
how do we do this idea of, working out this idea of, some things are easy, some things are too hard. How do I keep children at that level? So that's one of the other areas that we talk
Okay.
about. This role of interest in engagement and prior knowledge in determining, how well children can concentrate.
That is such a necessary topic. And as I'm sitting here thinking, you mentioned predictive and how that is necessary for kids. And I'm thinking about the phonics programs that are very predictive and repetitive, and children love to follow them because they feel really good because they know it's coming. Routines and how important routine is in a child's life in the home and in the school setting. So
Yeah.
I'm really thinking that this book is so
Mm.
important for our readers.
Mm.
Yeah, so there's loads. I'm really glad you said that, because there's a couple of things that I think are important. So yeah, we're actually doing trialing at the moment a maths intervention that tries to do the same thing of teaching in sequences. I
Oh,
do, we
okay.
do, you
Yes,
do,
right.
um, and using those kind of predictable sequences. Call and response.
Yeah,
What's nice, as you say, about phonics is that it lends themselves very much to, you see
it
it,
does.
say it, sound it, put
Uh-huh.
it in a sentence. You do the same sequence of things with every new phoneme that you're
Hmm.
teaching them. But it's, can we do the same thing with maths? And other types of learning. So that's one way. And daily routines, as you say, there's tons of evidence for that. And certainly
Yeah.
in the UK, there's a not very much appreciation. Particularly in early years settings. I always used to think when I picked up my kids from nursery, we do this thing handover where they tell you what your child does during the day, and
Oh, I
they would
love
always say, "Yeah, today we did this, and today we did that," and it was always something completely different to what they'd done yesterday. And there seems to be this huge pressure to be giving these rich and varied learning experiences. And I always wanted to say, no, no, no. What
that.
you should be saying to me is, today my 2-year-old daughter has done exactly the same things at exactly the same time as she'd done the day before.
Yeah.
But then there's also some work that we're doing looking at kind of predictability in a different sense, in the sense of brain rhythms. Yeah. So one of the reasons why these predictable daily routines we think are useful is that children's bodies are rhythmic. Yeah, you have these kind of rhythmic fluctuations. Yeah, and times when I have high energy activity, like when I'm running around outdoors doing boisterous physical play, and then times when my body naturally needs to calm down when I'm doing reading or something like that. Yeah. Um, and one of the reasons why these predictable daily routines are really important is because it allows my body to get, if I know what's coming in advance, I can get my body into that state in preparation for this thing that I know is coming. Yeah. Most well known in the context of a book at bedtime. Yeah. I learned
Oh,
to
right.
recognize a book at bedtime as a signal that bedtime is coming. So my body starts to make the chemical changes ready for sleep, 20 minutes before I actually go into sleep, which means I transition to sleep more smoothly. Yeah.
Hmm.
It's exactly the same idea for all these micro level transitions during the course of the day. Yeah. If I know that break time coming, because it's, always happens at the same time, I can get myself in that state in advance. Yeah. But this idea that if I've got a structure, yeah, so if I've got a rigid structure that I always do the same things at the same time each day, yeah, then my body rhythms can tune in to the rhythms in that structure, yeah, which makes it easier for me to latch and helps me to stay stable. And actually, it's the same idea. We think in terms of, we're doing quite a lot of work at the moment looking at rhythms in language at a much more fine-grained timescale. I got interested in this when I was reading to my own kids, and um, I don't know. I think you do have Gruffalo in the States, but I was looking. We had a lot of Julia Donaldson, and a mouse took a stroll through the deep dark wood. A fox saw the mouse, and the mouse looked good with these very, very da rhyming couplets. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and all of the books I remember looking through, trying to find a book to read to my son when he was about 18 months, and all of these books were had exactly the same da couplets,
Love
and
that.
got interested in why this is. And we think it's actually quite similar that so our brains are rhythmic. Yeah. So, if I were to measure your brain activity, I would get these, strong oscillations in around about kind of 7 cycles a second, strongest in an adult brain. And we know that when we're listening to language, our brain rhythms tune in to these speech rhythms. Um, and we speak at roughly a speed that's close to the rhythms that our brains are going at anyway, because it's easy then for the brain rhythms to tune in. Yeah. And if you give the child a really, really strong, predictable language content, yeah, that has these exaggerated dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-da rhyming couplets, we think that makes it easier for the child's brain rhythms to tune in to the speech rhythms. Yeah. And we think that that's why so much of the spoken content, kind of written content for children, has these kind of rhythms because it's easier for them to engage. So this is another form of predictability that's a little bit different to what we were talking about. It's about these kind of setting up rhythms in spoken language
Hmm.
to make it easier for young children to, tune into this predictability because it's rhythmic.
So true. And that really fosters language development as well. We have so much we could continue talking about, but we're almost out of time. And I know I really wanted to get into the work you do with teachers, but since we're coming to an end, we maybe save this for a part two at another time, because I'd love to hear how
Yeah.
you educate teachers and your work in early learning environments. We just have one final question, and that's really, do you have anything else which you want to share with our listeners that we've missed, or just
No,
a
I think,
last
I
thing?
guess, yeah, I think the most important thing is just one of the things I think I do feel very passionate about, the importance of neuroscience in early education. And I think the reason is because for me, the most important thing that neuroscience has taught us is that the world feels different from a young child's point of view. And it's very hard for us to be, aware of this if we're not, measuring their brain activity, because
Mhm.
you can't ask a young child to describe to you, how the world feels differently to them. Yeah. And then similarly, we don't have insights because development happens so slowly. It happens in stages. So I can't remember, how the world felt differently to me when I was a 2-year-old child. Yeah. Um, and one of the things that I think neuroscience is really important for is it gives us some insights into how children's brains, process sights and sounds around them differently. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, for example, that idea of, our brains tracking into speech, yeah, that I just was talking about. So that's one of the things that we measure. And we look at this idea of kind of noisy settings that I was talking about. And, we can ask children to focus in on one person's voice talking to them and to tune out kind of distracting background informations. And we can measure, how affected their brain activity is by these kind of background rhythms that they're trying to zone out. And we can see that, just as we'd expect from other areas, what we know about children's brain development, that they're more affected by noisy settings. So they find it harder to tune out distractions. So they kind of process sensory information differently to how adult brains process it. And this is really, really important. And I think, this is an area where I hope our understanding is going to grow a lot in future years.
Yeah.
And it's an area where, I hope in future years we'll get much better at designing, educational settings that appreciate that the world feels
Mhm.
different to a young child.
Thank
I think
you.
at the moment we do too much of designing practice for what is optimal for our adult brains and assuming it's the same for a child.
So true. Thank you so much for sharing that and for everything you shared with us today. We want to thank all of our listeners, our guests, past and present, for sharing their knowledge and work. And a special thank you to our producer, Penn Ketchum. You can find our podcast wherever you listen on YouTube, Spotify, Apple. We can't wait to learn from you and plant more seeds of learning together.